Hi there, welcome to this exam review for the 2019 AQA A-Level Psychology. I'm going to look at paper 1 in this video. Do subscribe to the channel, there's lots more videos on here including exam reviews for the other papers and eventually predictions for the 2020 exam series for psychology. What I'll do is I'll go through each of the sections on the exam and talk about what the poorly performing areas were. So hopefully if you're a student you'll be able to pick up some tips, and if you're a teacher it might give you some deeper understanding of some of the common problems that we know students are making. It's just worth noting that as the exam questions I'll be referring to are not in the public domain, I won't be using the exact wording of the question when going through them. Teachers, you can actually download a copy of this paper from AQA, and when the exam paper is made available to the public, I'll post a link to it on the description of this video. So here's your 4 topics in paper 1. We've got social, memory, attachment and psychopathology. It's worth just noting to begin with the steady decline in terms of paper 1 average performance over the 3 years, from 57% in 2017, 54% 2018 and then down to 52% in 2019. Okay, so we're going to begin here with social influence. We had 5 questions in social influence in 2019, and 2 of these were research methods questions. You had a nice AO1 question on the explanations of social influence in terms of resistance. It's perhaps not surprising then that the average mark for this question was actually quite high. It's worth pointing out that for a 4-mark question, many students on this question wrote way more than they needed to in order to get those 4 marks. We also saw a STEM question here on social change. What's become somewhat of a common theme on these AO2 STEM questions is students failing to effectively engage with the STEM, or indeed not actually engaging with the STEM at all. And that's why the average mark for this question seems so low. You simply can't ignore the application requirement in these types of questions. So although students are quite good at showing knowledge, it's the application point that's really kind of messing them up in this sense. Now we also had this ethical issues questions for social influence research, and there was a large amount of breadth here. Students could basically draw their answer from any area of research that they wanted to from the spec. Perhaps unsurprisingly, most chose the big gunners, Zimbardo, Milgram and Ash. And well, the quality of answers overall was really poor. Now students were really good at telling us what the ethical issues were. The problem is that this was a discuss question, and students didn't actually bother to discuss what these ethical issues were. For example, yes, arguably Milgram did cause psychological harm to participants by making them feel like they'd, well, practically killed poor old Mr. Wallace, but Milgram also conducted extensive post-experiment interviews with participants who, on the whole, actually said they were really happy to have taken part and they'd learned something important about themselves. So it's a shame really, because if students had perhaps taken a breath before actually diving into this question, they may have been able to get more of a sense of what the examiners were looking for. And it's also worth pointing out to students what the discuss command term actually means in reference to. It means describe and also evaluate. Now there was 2 research methods questions in social this year which proved a bit of a mixed bag. One of them required students to calculate a ratio for 2 marks. 76% of students managed, 76% was the average mark on this, which means I guess your modal mark is probably around 1 for students. What students really struggled to do, which was a 54% average mark, was justify the choice of a particular statistical test. So we're 3 years into the exam now. Justifying use of test has been on every single exam paper, and students are still really struggling how to do it. And you know, students need to remember that paper 1 will assess research methods, and paper 1 can draw on any research methods questions from the year 1 or the year 2 specification for research methods. Okay, the next topic then was memory. Now, there is again a poor performance overall from students in the memory section. There were 3 questions in memory this year. We'll actually start with what the biggest worry was for students this year. This was a 16-mark application question on the multi-store model of memory. And let's be honest, we saw this one coming. We saw that the MSM was going to be here in some kind of big context. Now we can see a bit of a pattern emerging here, as once again many students failed to engage with the STEM at all on this question. Even knowing that in a 16-mark question question like this, four marks are available for you for AO2, so ignore it at your peril. And what we've learned, which has been actually quite important for us as teachers from this question, is that AQA credit the elaborative rehearsal update to the MSN as AO3, not as AO1. And that's certainly worth bearing in mind should there be an AO1 only question on the multi-store model of memory in the future. Well, the key problem with this type of 16-mark question, you've got a big question here with quite a complicated application that you're supposed to draw reference to, is that very few students are actually taking time just to take a breath and plan out their answer. And this really shows in the lack of organisation in terms of their responses. This is similar to something we saw in the biopsych question in paper 2 this year that I'll talk about in the other video. And in reference to the AO3, the AO43 was very, very poor. We're seeing lots and lots of generic evaluations, methodological evaluations that are really going to struggle to get students any credit. Now, the next question was better. That being said, it was only worth 2 marks and was a very straightforward multiple choice question on the cognitive interview. So students did very well on that. Now, this question was then followed by an evaluation question on the cognitive interview. Again, saw this one coming, didn't we? Students largely bombed on this though. Most students scoring around kind of 2 or 3 out of 6. What students need to be aware of that when the command term is evaluate, they do not need to waste time on detailing the description. So we saw lots of waffle AO1 description in this that simply wasn't credit-worthy of the answer. So students finished their AO1 assume they've done the job, when indeed they haven't. So again, we've got this problem about understanding the command terms here. To discuss one in social that they seem to ignore, and then we've got a straightforward AO1 type question here, sorry, an AO3 type question, and they choose to include AO1 in their answers. And again, this is a common theme throughout the exam. Okay, attachment. Now, being as role of the father had yet to appear in the 2 previous exam series, it was a pretty safe bet that it was going to come up this year. The problem was that I think some students were slightly taken aback in terms of how these questions were asked. So we had 2 questions here. The first one that asked about findings of research into role of the father. Now, 69% as an average mark isn't actually that bad considering this question. The mistake, however, that some students are making is a common one. And that's to say, when they're asked for findings, they're giving way too much detail that isn't required, and they're making reference to the method of research. And this is obviously an issue in terms of focus of such responses. And like I say, it's really worth bearing in mind if a question asks you for findings, give the findings, not the method. Now, the next one was the economic implications question, and some students really seemed unprepared for this question, hence kind of low average mark there of 39%. Now, it's really worth remembering that you can get asked about the economic implications of anything that you have studied, and in this respect, students just weren't able to think on their feet and discuss what AQA was looking for, and that was basically making reference to paternity leave, reduction in the gender pay gap, and these were things that would have been covered in the AO3 evaluation of role of the father anyway. The last question on the influence of early attachment. Now again, this was a question that we foresaw coming. It hadn't been mentioned yet, but students were really unprepared for this question. It's a whole bullet point on the specification. So it's definitely worth considering going back to this and having a look. There's 2 layers to this question, the influence of early attachment on childhood and kind of adult relationships should you need that, but students were just so poorly performing in terms of their focus of this answer, the kind of material that they were using. We're seeing again lots and lots of generic methodological criticism, for example for Hazen and Shaver's love quiz, that don't really focus on what the requirements of this question were. Okay, so psychopathology. We'll start with the definitions question. So in 2017, there was a 16 marker on definitions and abnormality, and now it's back in 2019 as a STEM question, so 6 marks application. Students did okay with this. The average mark was 78%. But like we've seen on previous STEM questions, there was lots of students whose application in this question was really poor. And although the kind of AO1 descriptive element of this question was generally okay, students are mixing up these definitions of abnormality. Now, this was also something that was mentioned on the 2017 examiner's report. It's often a mistake that students are still making, so it's worth bearing that in mind for the future. There was a nice kind of 2-mark question on behavioural characteristics of depression, and although it was just a short AO1 question, many students neglected to do kind of much elaboration at all in their answers, and this is certainly something to bear in mind when revising the other characteristics and the other disorders for questions that are perhaps worth beyond 2 marks. There was a 2-process model evaluation. Now the 2-process model hadn't come up until the 2019 exam, so it perhaps wasn't surprising that it was here. It was only a short 2-mark AO3 question, just asking for 1 limitation. The error that students made here, and it's a trap that students so often fall into, is providing an argument about reductionism. Truly, I've banned the word reductionism apart from if it's to do with issues and debates. Basically because if you read the examiner's report over the years from AQA, it becomes pretty clear that students really never are able to use the term reductionism in an argument for evaluation very well. It tends to be a very, very generic point, that's to say. It would have been a much better argument for students to use the biological preparedness evaluation and explore maybe how some phobias seem to have an evolutionary basis and thus can't have been learned. Then we've got this neural explanations for OCD for 8 marks. And again, it was obvious something from biology was coming up because nothing had been on the exam across 2017, 2018. So we've got this 8-mark neural explanation question for OCD. And it was a very, very poor performance. Got an average mark here of 39%. Now the question asked for neural explanations. So basically kind of talking about the worry circuit and the malfunctioning of that as an explanation for OCD. But many students focused on the genetic explanation. Added to that, the evaluation was poor. So again, we've got students using reductionism and determinism now in their evaluation without being able to elaborate effectively on these evaluations at all. It's certainly something to bear in mind next year should genetic explanations come up. Do they actually know the difference between neural and genetic as of explanations? Then we finish with a STEM question that basically asked you to compare the use of a questionnaire and a case study. The problem with this in terms of the response is that students just lack the context. So in questions like these within the research methods context, of course, we know engagement with the STEM is absolutely crucial. So your answers must be given in the context of the STEM. You can't just make a generic statement about these research methods. Okay, so I hope that that was useful for you. Check out the paper 2 review within issues and debates as well that I've done, and later on in the year I'll be posting some predictions about the 2020 exam.